Chapter 21. The Daimler limousine that took Ellen Whitfield to the estate waited in a graveled parking area as the undersecretary herself strode into the magnificent building. The Chateau de Gournay, just 40 minutes to the northwest of Paris, was a treasure of 17th century architecture that, if far less ostentatious than nearby Versailles, was no less impressive in its details. Designed by Francois Monsart for a duke in Louis the 14th's court, the chateau is among the most noteworthy of its kind in France. From a foyer that was the apotheosis of the period's classicism to its much photographed buffet of carved stone. Buffet? I don't know what that word means besides with food. Anyway. The 11 bedrooms were intact from its original construction. The tennis court and pools were more recent additions. Over the past half-century, it had been used by international conferences of governmental and non-governmental organizations, by high-level conclaves of industrialists and their information-age successors. At the moment, it had been rented by a lavishly funded conservative think tank based out of Washington, at the behest of Professor Ashton Palmer, who chaired its Pacific Rim program, and who always preferred settings that expressed the very finest of what civilization had to offer. A liveried manservant greeted Undersecretary Whitfield in the foyer. Monsieur Palmer is waiting for you in the blue room, madam, the French servant told her. He was a man in his late 50s, with a broken nose, a square jaw, and a wiry build. A man who, one suspected, had a range of experiences and expertise that was greater than was strictly required by his ostensible position. Whitfield would not have been surprised if Palmer had hired a former member of the French Foreign Legion. He was a great believer in dual-purpose employees. The valet, who was also a translator, the butler, who was also a bodyguard. Palmer's penchant for multiplicity was related to an aesthetics of efficiency. He recognized that a person could play more than one role on the stage of history, that the best chosen action would achieve more than one effect. Palmer's doctrine of multiplicity was indeed key to the scenario that was even now being played out. The blue room turned out to be an octagonal bay overlooking the stables. The vaulted ceiling was at least 16 feet high, the carpets the finest broadlooms of the period, the chandeliers easily of museum quality. The undersecretary stepped over to the window, taking in the beautifully contoured landscape. The stables themselves, elegantly built of brick and wood, could have been converted into an elegant manse. They understood craftsmanship, didn't they? Ashton Palmer's voice. Ellen Whitfield turned and saw Palmer entering from a discreet set of pocket doors. She smiled. As you always say, it is not the skill, it is the degree of skill. That was the striking thing about the Sun King's court. The very highest level of civility, the greatest appreciation for accomplishments in literary, artistic, natural scientific, and architectural realms. At the same time, there was much they were oblivious to, the seismic instabilities of the social order they battened upon, the basis for the revolution that would consume their children a century later. Theirs was a spurious sort of peace, which contained the seeds of its own destruction. People are quick to forget what Heraclitus taught us. Quote, war is common, strife is customary, and all things happen because of strife and necessity. Unquote. It's good to see you, Ashton, Whitfield said warmly. These are, dare I invoke the old Chinese curse, interesting times. Ashton Palmer smiled. His silver hair was thinner than it had been when Whitfield was his student, but no less tidy. His forehead high and impressive, sheer intelligence radiated from his slate eyes. There was something ageless about him, something that transcended the day-to-day. Whitfield had, in the course of her career, encountered many figures deemed historic, but she believed that he was the one truly great man she had ever met, a visionary in every sense. It had been a privilege when she first made his acquaintance. She was conscious of it even then, when she was in her early 20s. She was equally conscious of it now. "What have you to tell me?" the sage asked. Whitfield knew he had just flown straight from Hong Kong, but he looked remarkably rested. "So far, everything has been happening exactly as you've predicted." There was a gleam in the Undersecretary's eye. "As you envisioned, I should say." She glanced at herself in the elegant Venetian mirror. The pewter light of a French winter shafted through the leaded glass, accentuating her high cheekbones and strong features. Her chestnut hair, parted on one side, was carefully coiffed. She wore a cerise, C-E-R-I-S-E, skirt suit, and a single strand of pearls around her neck. Subtle eyeshadow brought out the blue of her irises. "Quite a place you've got here." "The Center for Policy Studies is about to hold a conference here. Currency regulation, an East-West perspective." What did you tell your people?" "The Chateau de Gournay is on the itinerary, no worries. Meeting with scholars on currency liberalization." "Because precautions must still be taken." "I'm well aware of this," the Undersecretary said. She sat down at the giltwood table, and Palmer joined her there. "I remember the first time I heard you lecture," she said, looking off through the leaded glass. "I was a Radcliffe undergraduate. You were teaching a survey course on global dominion held at Sanders Theater, and you wrote 3 German words on the board: Machtpolitik, Geopolitik, and Realpolitik. Someone in the back of the lecture hall called out, 'Are we going to have to speak German?' And you said no, but that there was a language we'd need to learn, and that only a few of us here would gain fluency in it. The language of politics." Palmer's eyes crinkled in recollection. "I thought it fair to warn people." "That's right," she said. "You announced that most of us just would never have the knack, that only a few of us would master it on a high level, while the rest would fall into the cliches of the historically insignificant. The local alderman's view of the universe, I think you called it. Strong stuff for young minds." "You had the mental sinews even then," Palmer said. "The sort of tough-mindedness you either have or you don't. I remember when you talked about Genghis Khan, about how in modern terms, one would have to say that he was devoted to trade liberalization and freedom of religion, because that was how he ran his empire." "Which was precisely what made him so dangerous." He spread his hands out upon the pearwood marquetry. "Exactly. And on the map you showed the extent of the Khan Empire, how by 1241 his son and heir, Ogode, had taken Kiev, destroyed a German army in the east, pushed through Hungary, and reached the gates of Vienna. Then the hordes stopped. The Mongol Empire was almost exactly coterminous with the Eastern Bloc. That was the mind-blower. You showed us the 2 areas, one of the Mongol Dominion, the other the Communist Empire, from North Korea and China all the way to Eastern Europe. It was the same area, the footprint of history, you called it, and it was mere fortuity that the Mongols stopped at Vienna." "Mere fortuity," Palmer repeated. "Ogode had died, and the army leaders wanted to return to help select his successor. You showed us that there was a pattern to the great empires. In the 16th century, Suleiman the Magnificent was the most powerful Ottoman Sultan, And he was also the most committed to basic principles of equal justice, procedural fairness, free trade. As a historical proposition, you prove that the Eastern empires were always dangerous to the West in proportion to how liberal they were internally. A good many people have been unable to read the writing on the wall, Palmer said, especially when it's in Chinese. And you explained to these sleepy-eyed kids how for the past several centuries, China, the Middle Empire, had never posed a threat to Western hegemony, even though in principle it couldn't have been its greatest rival. Chairman Mao was the real paper tiger. In China, the more totalitarian the regime, the more cautious, purely defensive, and inward-looking its military posture. It was powerful material, powerfully delivered. The smart kids weren't sleepy-eyed anymore once they realized the implications of what you were saying. I remember getting goosebumps. Yet, some things don't change. Your colleagues in the State Department still refuse to see the plain truth, that as China has become more Western in its governance, it has also become more of a menace, militarily as well as economically. The president of China has a pleasant face, and that face has blinded our government to the reality that he, more than anyone, is determined to awake a slumbering dragon. He glanced at his slim, elegant Patek Philippe wristwatch. Whitfield noticed that it displayed sidereal time as well as the Eastern Standard and Beijing times. Even when I was a student, you seemed to understand so much more than anyone else. The seminar on international relations I took in my first year of graduate school, there is a sense of being one of the Illuminati. 50 students applied. I admitted only 12. An amazing bunch. I couldn't have been the most brilliant of them. No, he allowed, but you were the most capable. She remembered the first day of the grad seminar. Professor Palmer had talked about how the world looked from the perspective of the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli in the late 19th century, at the helm of a mighty Pax Britannica. Disraeli must have assumed that his empire was imperishable, that the next century would belong to the British and their powerful navy. A few decades into the next century, Britain had been reduced to a second-rate power. It was a transformation, Palmer said, akin to the Roman Empire turning into Italy. The 20th century was the American century. America's industrial and economic supremacy was unchallenged in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the elaborate mechanisms of its military command posts projected its power to the farthest reaches of the globe. But it would be a mistake to assume, Palmer warned, that the next century was America's by right. Indeed, if the Middle Kingdom was fully to rouse itself, the next century could belong to it. The center of global preeminence could move east, and policies of quote-unquote constructive engagement were exactly the sort of thing that would strengthen the Chinese and speed their ascendancy. Echoing Marx's repudiation of the French Marxists of the 1870s, Ashton Palmer had once quipped that he was not a Palmerite. He was disavowing vulgar misconceptions of his core doctrines, the people who inferred historical inevitabilities from his work. Palmer's method brought together the grand history of longue durée, the history of centuries-long epochs, with the micro-history of the very near term. It could not be reduced to slogans, saws, formulas, and nothing was inevitable. That was a crucial point. To believe in historical determinism was to embrace passivity. The history of the world was a history of actions taken by human beings. Such actions made human history. Such actions could remake it. The liveried manservant cleared his throat. Professor Palmer, he said, you've received a transmission. Palmer turned to Whitfield with an apologetic look. If you'll excuse me. He disappeared down a long hallway. When he returned a few minutes later, he looked both anxious and energized. Everything is falling into place, he told Whitfield, which raises the pressure. I understand. What about Tarquin? As I said, everything is falling into place. And his newfound companion, any concerns on that front? No cause for concern. We're keeping an eye on things. I can't impress this upon you enough. 72 hours remain. Everyone must play his role to perfection. So far, Undersecretary Whitfield assured him, everybody has. Including Tarquin? Palmer demanded, his slate eyes flashing. Whitfield nodded with a trace of a smile, especially Tarquin. Ambler's eyes were fixed straight ahead as he left 2 Rue de Saint Florentin. He wanted to look like a man with no time to waste. That was not a great challenge, for he was a man with no time to waste. Once he was out on the street and away from the consulate, he adjusted his gait, adopting the air of an aimless stroller, as he walked past the red awnings and glittering shop windows. He was walking away from the Place de la Concorde toward the Rue Saint-Honoré, from peace to honor, he supposed, acutely aware of his surroundings while affecting to be lost in his own world. Environmental alertness was more than a matter of seeing. It was also a matter of listening. One always had to listen for the footfalls of someone, out of view, hurrying and then slowing down in an effort to maintain a constant distance from the one he was following. Someone was following him, Ambler realized, but not in accordance with any clandestine mode of operating. Ambler heard the sound of someone hurrying in his direction, someone with legs significantly shorter than his, and, to judge from the faint panting sound, someone in poor physical condition. Ambler knew he should feel alarm, yet the man scurrying after him was moving with all the subtlety of a waiter chasing a customer who had forgotten to pay his check. Perhaps that was the very point of the ruse, to overcome a seasoned operative's suspicions by an excess of obviousness. Ambler lengthened his stride and turned left at the end of the block onto the narrower Rue Cambon, and then, after a short jaunt, onto the Rue du Mont Thabor. 50 feet ahead of him was an alleyway, serving some of the adjoining boutiques. He passed before it and pretended to check his wristwatch. Reflected on its dial, he saw the man who had been pursuing him. With a swift, sudden movement, he whirled around and grabbed the stranger, wresting him into the alley and against a graffiti-strewn cinder block wall. The man was a singularly unimpressive specimen of humanity. Pasty-faced, out of breath, with thinning black hair, faint hollows beneath his eyes, and a bit of a paunch. His forehead was gleaming with sweat. He was perhaps 5'6" and looked entirely out of his element. His clothing, a cheap tan raincoat, a polyblend white shirt, and some sort of nondescript boxy gray suit, was American, sold there if not manufactured there. Ambler watched his hands to see whether he would make a move toward a concealed weapon or device. "You're Tarquin, right?" the pallid stranger asked, breathing hard. Ambler slammed him against the wall. "Ow!" the man protested, and ran his hands over his clothes. His fingertips alert to any kind of weapon. The pen that was a little too thick, a little too long. The wallet that seemed just a bit too bulky for a payload of paper and plastic. Nothing. Now Ambler stared at him hard, searchingly, looking for any flicker of guile. "Who wants to know?" "Take your hands off me, you piece of shit," the man spat. There was a trace of Brooklyn in his voice, though just a trace. "I said, who wants to know?" The man drew himself up, a look of affronted dignity on his face. "The name's Clayton Caston." He did not offer to shake hands.